There is a white SUV parked in the handicap zone, and it's white. The back hatch is open, just so that you know. I want to check on that, see if it's your vehicle. So we've been having a bit of a busy week here. And you can see from the remnants, we had a yard sale on Saturday, and we did pretty good. It was a lot of work this past week. I don't think we could have done it all without Miriam.
Yeah.
Thank you, Miriam. And somehow I left my total somewhere. 643 is what we brought in. Well, I will share with you that my better half, when I told him how everybody worked so hard, and the aches and pains and the huffing and puffing that we all did, he said, well, I will donate $500. And now we're up over $1,100 for our yard sale. So we give thanks for that. Yay, Dennis. Well, this past Wednesday, if you were here, we started our Lenten season with Ash Wednesday. And we're into the Lenten season now, and that's why we have those Lenten offering boxes. I'm just going to give you another little plug to make sure you pick one up when you leave today. All right? But we're into that time of year where we prepare our hearts and ourselves for the Easter season. Good Friday is always emotional. And then there's Easter Sunday, which is quite glorious and celebratory. But we're preparing ourselves for all of that. And during this Lenten season, we're going to be looking, except for next Sunday, because we have a guest preacher as part of Black History Month joining us. But for the other Sundays during Lent, we're going to be looking at questions that Jesus asked. Now, does anybody have a guess? If you just want to throw out a number, how many questions do you think in the Gospels that Jesus actually put out there and asked people?
3.
Anybody else? She's way off.
Well, it's a sermon 3 point.
Okay. Over 300. Over 300. Yeah, we won't be looking at all 300 of them. But there's a story from the days of Abraham Lincoln when he was president of the United States. He had a young man on his staff that was an avid church goer. He had a new pastor come to his church, and he was quite excited. The pastor was charismatic and a gifted orator. People started flocking to the church to hear him, and undoubtedly they probably came from other nearby churches because they wanted to hear the newest and latest phenomenon in the community. And every Monday morning, that aide would be in the president's office and give him a recap of the sermon from the next Sunday. And the last Sunday, and he kept saying, "You need to come to church and hear him. You should come and worship with us on Sunday." Well, after a while, finally the president, perhaps just to put an end to the badgering, said, "Okay, I'll come." He went to church with his aide that following Sunday. The pews were packed. The pastor must have preached an awe-inspiring sermon. The aide couldn't wait to get into the presidential carriage and ride back to the White House, and he quickly asked, "What did you think?" The president rather nonchalantly said, "It was fine." The aide was disappointed. He said, "Well, surely you were impressed with his eloquence and his insight into the scriptures." The president, looking at a newspaper, shrugged and said, "I suppose." And that was it. And they rode in silence for a while until the aide couldn't withhold asking, "Mr. President, you seem unimpressed. Do you mind my asking why?" Mr. Lincoln took his glasses off, looked at the man, and said, "Because he didn't ask me to do anything." Now, there's some speculation as to whether Abraham Lincoln was a Christian. Some believe he was more of a theist, but Lincoln certainly did know his scriptures, and he knew the words of Jesus, and he probably believed that the country didn't need another church full of impressed listeners, but what the world needed was followers willing to live out what they heard. And this must have been what Jesus had in mind when he stunned and probably disappointed a crowd of listeners when he asked the question, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I ask you?" And this is the question we consider today in our series for this Lenten season. The questions Jesus asked, and as I mentioned, he asked over 300. He used this as a way of teaching more so than parables. He understood that the lessons that stick with us are not necessarily the ones that are just handed to us. They are brought out of us, and good questions draw out the best lessons. So what might Jesus want to draw out of us by asking us the question this morning? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but don't do the things that I ask you? Well, let's start by noting that this question is not for everybody. This question is for religious people, those that call Lord, Lord. People who perhaps spend a lot of time in church, people like ourselves. Jesus is pointing to what is a gap between professed beliefs and actual behavior. So one of the first things we can note about this question is that Jesus isn't calling us to be religious. He's calling us into a way of living. Why is that? Well, the question comes at the end of Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. And listen to some of the actions that Jesus calls us to. He calls us to love your enemy. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Give to everyone who asks of you. Do to others as you would have them do unto you. Do not judge. Forgive. Give to the poor. Do justice. Do not defraud anyone. Do not hate. Do the things that make for peace. Clearly, these are not easy things. This way of life Jesus calls for us is a demanding one, is a challenging one. And true discipleship understands that challenge is part of obedience. Living the words of Jesus is a challenging thing. An English author and philosopher by the name of Chesterton said, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." Is it easy to live the words of Jesus? Definitely not. Jesus didn't come so that churches would be packed with interested listeners. He came so that people would be inspired to put his teachings into practice. Jesus isn't calling us to a comfortable life, but a compelling life. Maybe this is why Jesus compares the living of his teachings to the building of a house. If you build a solid foundation, then when the floods come, the house will stand firm and secure. But if you don't take that time and trouble to build a solid foundation when those floods come, the house will be washed away. Jesus is saying that our lives are like building a house. If we want convenience, we will sacrifice dependability. But if we want dependability, we will be willing to sacrifice convenience. This is where I want to acknowledge that this question does bring about some discomfort, even with my own self. Why do you not do what I say? Jesus asks. It feels a bit judgmental. It feels a bit preachy, and almost as if a finger raises from the page and is pointing at us. Why don't you do those things? And he talks about not just blessing those who bless us. He's saying stand up for people who others don't stand up for. Bless people who can't bless you back. It makes the world better. It lessens hatred and division. It's simply a good way to live. That thought was a game changer for me about this question of Jesus. Why don't you do what I say? And Jesus isn't pointing fingers at anyone here. He's saying, mind the gap. Have you ever been to London and rode the Underground? You know that when the train pulls up to a station and the doors open, there's a mechanical voice that says in a British accent, mind the gap. The gap is that space between the train and the platform, and you can easily trip and fall. So we're reminded to mind the gap. The difference between what we profess with our mouth and the lives that we actually live. There's a gap many times. I want to share with you my own gap story. This goes back a number of years. Not too many. I was in high school. Don't laugh too hard. I was in high school, and I was in the high school band, and we were having a rehearsal one evening for some upcoming performance, and we were on a break. We were in the cafeteria, and one of the students there said, you know, that soda machine over there, if you lift up that bottom flap, and you reach your hand inside, if you get up far enough, you can feel the can, and if you pull, you'll get a can of soda. So I tried it. I did what they suggested. I lifted up that bottom flap, and I reached my hand up, and I could feel it, and I tugged, and I tugged, and I tugged, and finally that can of soda came down, and I was quite pleased with myself. Look what I did. This band geek. Yeah, he's a little bit daring, isn't he? Well, later that evening, somebody from the band that I really didn't know, I recognized them, I didn't know their name. They came up to me and they said, I was surprised you got that can out. And I thought they were trying to figure out how it actually was accomplished. How did you go about it? And I started to tell them and explain, no, he said, that's not why I'm asking, or that's not why I'm surprised. He said, I thought you were one of those Christian people. That has stayed with me all my life. I thought you were one of those Christian people. Sometimes there's a gap, isn't there? He recognized the life that I was trying to live, but sometimes it's not always easy. When it comes to living the words of Jesus, we all have gaps. We have spaces where we fall short. And this can't be about living the words of Jesus perfectly. Do you live them perfectly? I don't. I don't need a religion that just tells me what I want to hear. I don't need a religion that pats me on the back on Sundays and says, there, you'll be okay. That doesn't help. What I need is a religion that will get personal, maybe even invasive, and so that my life is impacted by these words that I say, and that I believe, and that I live them out. So before we conclude, I want to offer a few thoughts to help us think about our own gaps. You might consider which of these are most relevant to you. Thinking about the question Christ asked, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you to do? What could be some of those reasons? Is it comfort? Maybe you want faith that just comforts you, provides solace and relief, and there's nothing bad about that, but by itself it can create a gap where a call to practice justice or advocate for others feels controversial or uncomfortable, and we just want a faith that keeps things peaceful. Or maybe we live with so much turmoil already, we're just tired and we don't have the energy to do more. It may be helpful to understand that there are some comforts that don't come from just hearing. When our lives are in turmoil and we wonder where God is, sermons and prayers start to become flat. There is a peace and energy that comes from doing. Maybe it's about time. Could a gap between our beliefs and our actions have to do with the fact that we are just plain busy people? We don't take time to think much about how our faith might play a role in our work, in our everyday life. We're too busy living. If so, we might need to ask, are the things that actually occupy so much of my life going to give me everything I'm looking for in life? Or are they just cluttering it all up? Is it fear? Maybe you have a good idea of what living Jesus' words mean in the world, but there is a fear of what would happen if you actually lived them out. What would others think? What would others think? Might it cost you friendships? If so, then remember, cost cuts both ways. What is the cost of not doing? Only when we get beyond the fear of what could be lost can we embrace what could be gained. Could it be an attention? Living your faith just hasn't been something you've given much attention to. Faith has been one of many things going on in your life, but not necessarily greater than all the other things that are going on. But don't wait until the storm comes and washes things away. Maybe now is the time to say, I want to make my faith a larger part of my life. Or is it something other than those things? Is there something else that might be the reason for any gaps between your beliefs and your behaviors? Again, I know so much of this feels judgy and preachy, but it's not. Jesus wants to help us build lives that matter, lives that make a difference, lives that stand strong when the storms come. And the storms will come. But a faith that gets put into action finds strength that withstands the storms. Has God been whispering into your heart for you to do something? Last week we put out a call. We needed somebody to take on the ministry of the birthday cards, and I thank that person for stepping up. Maybe God is whispering in your heart for you to step up and do something. When others look at our lives, what do they see? Are we doing our best? We're going to fail. There's no doubt about it. But we serve a God of second and third chances, and fourth and fifth chances, as long as we make the effort. Has God been whispering into your heart to do something? If so, let your doing be the amen to this sermon. God bless you.